every year, National Federation of High School puts out new rules, rules changes, manual changes, and points of emphasis. For officials, it's important to understand that when these things occur, when the information comes down, that it is for all of the stakeholders in the game. It's not just for basketball officials. It's for, if there's indications about changes starting in 2 years with the basketball, or, a few years ago, a division line had to be marked, right? There's no penalty for that. Adding these things in to the rules book, because the rules book is used as a reference for all of the stakeholders in the game. So we want to make sure that we take what is pertinent as basketball officials when we look at the new rules and points of emphasis. So today we are looking at points of emphasis. Let's get started. We'll be looking at rules, a change to the manual, some minutia, and points of emphasis. Our first is a rules change. Shot clocks and head coverings. National Federation of High School has decided to memorialize in the rules book rules regarding shot clocks. So starting in the 22-23 season, states are allowed to adopt shot clock rules. Now there are currently seven states that have shot clock rules, and new states will follow. I believe in the past, NFHS, was very firmly against the adoption of shot clocks. If a state adopted shot clocks, there were penalties put on the state in terms of their ability to participate in certain things in the NFHS hierarchy, right? The NFHS did not want shot clocks. Pressure from above, pressure from colleges, etc., pressure from states, has led to NFHS now saying shot clocks may be adopted. Does this mean shot clocks will be in your state in the next year, the next 2 years, the next 5 years, the next 10 years? Not necessarily. So all this is doing is laying the groundwork for future adoption of shot clocks. Now, as an official who's officiated in California, I have never officiated a game that did not have a shot clock, a high school game. It's not the boogeyman. It's not something to be afraid of. It makes the game better. It's just a thing. And all I could say is I encourage you to embrace the fact that it is not a dark cloud that is coming on your game. Now, you may have a perspective that says, no, this is not part of high school basketball. High school basketball is something pure and this, that, and the other thing, and this is an abomination and what have. Okay, have at it. Have at it. It makes the game better. It's not a big deal. It's not hard to implement. There's a cost involved. We have to train some personnel, but it's a good thing. And in addition, we have head coverings, clarification about head coverings. We're changing the rules. So in National Federation of High School new rules, we have by state association adoption effective with the 22-23 season, member state associations may establish a shot clock in which the team in control shall attempt to try for goal within 35 seconds after gaining team control. It creates Articles 1 and 2 and makes things very straightforward. It's just paving the way for the adoption. It says, in addition, it says, okay, we're going to add future information about rules and restrictions on shot clocks, and that'll be interesting because a lot of information will have to be added on the case play side. And if you can get a shot clock that's above the stanchion, that's indicated here, that it's built above the backboard, that's fantastic. That's much, right? So shot clocks are coming. I believe I saw something online that Iowa is going to adopt shot clocks starting next season or this coming season, right? States always have the freedom to do that. Like I say, I believe NFHS says, okay, if you do that, right, you're going outside the boundaries of what we want, and there's going to be some sort of repercussions on the administrative level. Okay. In addition, we have head coverings. So let's review the past rule. In the rule 3.5, Article 4, wristbands and headgear must meet the following guidelines, right? It provides all the restrictions and then says, exception, state associations may on an individual basis, right? Individual basis, meaning player John Doe has their administrator appeal to the state and say, John Doe wears a religious head covering. We are looking for an exemption that allows them to play, right? This is already in place. This is going to be on a state-by-state level. Some states, I think, have just already said, look, if it's religious, they can wear it, no restriction, right? We don't want to get into that hornet's nest, etc. So this is the rule as it exists, and it says it breaks it out into two categories, right? One is medical cosmetic, right? Let's say a player suffers some sort of hair loss disease or something, and their hair is patchy, and they need a head covering to cover that. Or they have had concussions, and they need some sort of protective covering that allows them to play with a reduced risk of further injury. Okay? These kind of things, the state says, or the NFHS says, appeal to the state, right? Get a letter, get that letter into the coaches. The coach has an availability. So when the officials show up, the officials could say, Coach, do we have a letter providing an exemption for wearing that headband, that concussion headband? We need that by rule, etc. And then in addition, for religious reasons, in the event there is documented evidence provided to the state that a participant may not expose his or her uncovered head, the state association may approve a covering or wrap which is non-abrasive, hard, etc. Right? So NFHS says if in either of these two categories, a letter is required. That's the old rule, right? And now we're going to have a rules change where religious reasons does not require the exemption. Religious reasons does not require a letter from the state. Player shows up with a turban or some sort of head wrap, etc. Legal by rule. No need for a letter requiring. This is an NFHS rule. Okay, so this would be a yarmulke. This would be a head covering. So some head coverings just cover the hair. Some go around the chin, or what have you. And we'll have some examples of those. But the restriction for cosmetic or medical has not been replaced. So the rules book has been changed to say that religious is now legal, medical and cosmetic remains requiring a letter from a state, a governing body. Now, these kind of rules and restrictions are always handled differently at the association, the state level, the area level, the association level, etc. Many officials, it's like, will not address anything religious or medical, cosmetic, and just say, look, man, we're just gonna go with that, right? So the helmet, the padded helmet, the concussion-related helmet remains requiring state approval. So some examples of, this is a player at Indiana State who wears a head covering, as well as leg coverings, right? These would be considered religious headwear, right? So we can get also the situation where we have headwear that extends, down. It may be tucked in, as in 32, or maybe not be tucked in. But again, this is religious head covering by rule, legal. Right? So we, obviously, if it's legal, there's no color restriction. So in this instance, we have players who are wearing a white head covering, and then underneath there's an additional covering. These would be considered legal by rule. Very stylish, tucked in, right? All good. And a couple of different examples. The way a wrap is, there's a bun in the, a protrusion in the front, or it's not, right? And these are all things that can come into play. Now, what's not a religious, so those are all examples of religious headgear. Here's some examples that would not, that would be cosmetic or for protection, right? This player, I guess, this collegiate player wearing a boxing headgear, right? Related to concussion issues, etc. This is the example of something that would be required to have a letter, right? Much more low profile soccer player headgear. This is the one that's commonplace in the game, the concussion-related headgear that goes around the forehead. And they can come in various sizes. This one is not as well branded, or it's, a little more de facto, right? So just to clarify, when we have religious, it is now legal by rule, does not require a letter. If it is cosmetic or protective related, it does require a letter from the state. Now, again, this is all handled differently at different association levels. Some associations would say, hey, listen, if they're wearing a concussion helmet of any sort, legal, right? We're not in the business of getting, we're not going to force that. It's a de facto covering of the rule. So check with your local association on that. A change to the manual. The elimination of the punch. No longer will we use signal 37, the team control foul signal, and we will adopt the player control foul signal for all team control fouls. Preceded by the stop clock signal, signal 4. The same hand used to stop the clock is placed at the back of the head, signal 36. The directional signal, signal 6, shall be given and then indicate the ensuing throw-in spot. This is for a common foul committed by a player while that player is in control of the ball, or by an airborne shooter, a common foul committed by a member of the team that has control. So the punch no longer and instead we go to the behind the head signal, right? So I guess we've got a stop clock, same hand, which would be a good discipline technique. Stop clock, same hand behind the head, and point is the approved NFHS signal for both player control and team control. But NFHS looking for consistency here. The rationale of confusion, I don't know if I buy that. I think the inconsistency maybe more of an issue here. But the punch is gone. Long live the punch. And then we have some minutia to deal with in the rules. A cue collar. Anybody heard of that? And uniform color, right? So this is why this is here. I could not tell you. This cue collar is a product that is new, that is worn by players in other sports, I guess, and is the idea is to prevent concussions. And the way that it does it is it restricts blood flow. I don't know what the technology is. It's not protective. I guess it's to have less. I don't know the rationale. NFHS has chosen to add this and say this is not illegal, right? So this is something that is worn around the neck, and it's tight to the skin. It's not loose. NFHS has said this is legal by rule, and then also tries to clarify about visitors' uniforms meeting a certain color threshold, right? And this is a great example of this is this directed to the officials? Or are we going to take this color chart and take it with us and say, hey, player, before the game, okay, your uniform is only 60%. Okay, so that's going to be an illegal uniform. We're going to have a technical foul on the head coach, right? This is for uniform manufacturers, right? This is for teams so that they know that they must meet this threshold when they order new uniforms, etc. Yeah, there's that. Points of emphasis. What do we have this year? Team control signal, timeout administration, unsporting conduct, screening, traveling, including Euro steps, spin moves, and jump stops. When it comes to points of emphasis, NFHS produces points of emphasis. Sometimes this is a shift in the game, right? When the NFHS added hand-checking rules a few years ago, it was in a specific effort to mimic other levels of play, which focused, the rules of which focused on freedom of movement. NFHS said specifically, we want more freedom of movement in the game. Here's a rule to help with that. Now we're going to sort of shift the direction of the way games are officiated. Oftentimes, though, points of emphasis are just the things that need correction by the massive groups of officials. So who is this addressed to, right? We've got varsity boys in Alaska to freshman girls in Florida. We've got JV boys in San Diego all the way up to JV girls in Maine. It covers all levels of high school basketball. It covers the entire country, right? And other levels as well that use National Federation of High School Basketball rules. So feedback comes from the national feedback bubbles up. Administrators, coaches, officials provide information that says this part of the game is becoming inconsistent, right? And so we get the usual suspects. Obviously the team control signal change is new, but timeout administration, unsporting conduct, screening, and traveling, these are points of emphasis every other year, as it were. Add into it rough play, rebounding, throw in administration. These are always areas that constantly need to be readdressed. So when we look at these this year, let's take a look. Points of emphasis, officiating mechanics. So NFHS says, you officials that deviate from approved mechanics by, bringing in collegiate mechanics or unapproved signals in mechanics, right? This is confusing to stakeholders in the game and should be corrected. So officials are instructed to use only approved National Federation of High School signals and mechanics when officiating basketball games, right? And that's really straightforward. And the basis for this is that it is confusing to the stakeholders in the game. Signals are definitely the way that we communicate to players, coaches, table personnel, fans, and other officials on the floor what has occurred, right? It is how we communicate, etc. When we interpret points of emphasis, when we interpret signals, when we interpret mechanics, it's like figuring out what are we trying to accomplish here and doing that, right? Mechanics put us in position to have the best look at plays, builds in safeguards for dead ball officiating and all of these things, right? If we understand that, that's really the key. Not that, okay, in this era of robotics, you could program a robot to, take the proper path when reporting a foul. But the fundamental concept here is we need to communicate with our signals what has occurred in the game. We need to have signals that clearly communicate, right? NFHS says that the way to do that is to use strictly approved signals. That's what NFHS says. In addition, we're focusing on timeout administration. This became a point of emphasis within the last 5 years, where timeouts were being erroneously granted when a team did not have control of the ball, or not granted when a team did have control of the ball, right? So again, our points of emphasis say, okay, hey, officials, let's review. Let's review when a team may call a timeout by rule, right? We need to have player control. Or during a live ball. During a dead ball, either team can call a timeout. NFHS says granting timeout requests, ideally granting the timeout should be the responsibility of the primary coverage official. However, other officials may become aware that a timeout is being requested. In all cases, officials must be certain there is player control prior to granting the timeout request. Officials should also be aware of situations where timeouts are more likely to be requested, end of period, game, or a team has made several baskets in a row, right? So good basic officiating concepts, being aware of what's going in the game, anticipating what coaching action we may have, right? Calling official is, of course, in great position, or the player where the ball is in their primary, is in a great position to see whether player control exists, but they're not necessarily the best official to recognize a timeout. We could have a coach, 60 feet away requesting a timeout. One of the other officials on the crew should be aware of the possibility. But the guidance here is that if we are, if the ball is out of our primary, to ensure that we have player control, right? So if we have a loose ball scenario where the ball is not necessarily in player control and we have a request from a timeout, to not simply respond to the request for timeout, right? To just ensure that player control exists on the court during live ball situations. That's the purpose of this point of emphasis. Really straightforward, and it's going to be easier for us to adopt, right? Just taking that extra instant, or just being aware that that is a requirement. Obviously, if the ball's loose on the floor and the coach calls a timeout during live ball play, we cannot grant that by rule. Of course, there are situations where timeouts are granted, and we need to also understand what we do in those situations, right? So if we are looking at our play scenario here, player loses control, bounces the ball off their foot, the ball is bouncing away, we grant the timeout. whoa, whoa, the gym explodes. The ball was loose. You can't do that, right? We can do that. We could actually grant the timeout to either coach, erroneously here in this instance, but we could. And what do? We grant the timeout. They get the timeout. They use the timeout, and then we resume with the point of interruption. In this instance, we've got a player who had player control, has an interrupted dribble by dribbling the ball off their foot. The ball is loose, but with a point of interruption was white in team control. And we go to the spot where the ball was when the whistle was blown, because we know the basics. All right. And our old favorite, unsporting conduct, right? For as long as we officiate high school basketball, this will come back around every few years because conduct is consistently an issue. Some people think that conduct is getting worse. Some people think it remains bad, etc. But it's a consistent issue. What we have here is the committee is concerned about inappropriate conduct by players, bench personnel, coaches, officials, and spectators. Programs are educationally based, and conduct that is not tolerated in other educational settings shall not be accepted. Therefore, each group has the responsibility to demonstrate civility and citizenship, right? So now marching orders are given. Game management needs to have this responsibility. Remember, points of emphasis are not just for officials, they're for other stakeholders in the game. So NFHS says game management needs to be proactive and address, hey, spectator A, spectator B, these people are problematic. We need to give them, we're going to go up, they're going to go up the game ladder, go up the ladder of penalties, right? Initially, hey, you need to knock it off, or we go up, the game management goes up and says, listen, that's unacceptable behavior. One more outburst and you will be asked to leave. Right? Or they may just say, hey, patron A is out. We're going to eject them immediately. Right? They have different levels that they can go. Some game administrators sometimes will go sit near potentially abusive parents to just give that proximity and help them deal with things. Obviously, if we have a student section that is doing something inappropriate that needs to be addressed, we would expect game management to do that. But if not, the game officials need to step in. And officials should not tolerate inappropriate conduct from coaches and players. And here's a key point. The team huddle is not a safe haven for coaches' bad language. Just as a classroom teacher should not verbally abuse students, neither should coaches use bad language when addressing their player, right? And this is a thing, right? Oftentimes officials will say, hey, when he's laying into his team, if he was saying that to me, we're either whacking him or he's gone. But, part of basketball is having your coach chew you out and et cetera, et cetera. And if HS says, okay, let's focus on this area and not allow this. And what we also have to remember is a lot of times you've got you've got the school principal, right? And they're over on the sidelines and they do not like this behavior by this coach, right? They want the officials to address this, right? This is not appropriate for their school, etc. So we have to be aware of that. But NFHS says, don't allow the coach to have a safe haven in the team huddle. Players are not permitted to let off steam by using profanity, even if it is not directed at an opponent or an official. Being angry at oneself is no excuse, right? So NFHS says, yeah, you've got that player who missed the layup, right? And they go to just right? And an expletive comes out. And it's not directed at an opponent, what have you. NFHS says, treat that in the same fashion as if it was directed at an opponent. It is something that is not to be tolerated. if we hear that. And officials are not exempt from unsporting conduct. What? Inappropriate references to players, coaches, or other officials is not acceptable. Inappropriate behavior before, during, or after the game should be reported to the officials association or assigner. Well, obviously, so it's a scholastic setting. This is a high school event, right? Behavior has to achieve a basic level. So obviously, officials' conduct is not exempt, although there would be no penalty, right? If the official, after making a bad call, utters an expletive, we are not assessing a technical foul on the official, right? But NFHS says that this is something that should be addressed, it should be reported, etc. Right? That's the purpose of this language. Spectators should be held to the account, right? NFHS says spectators do not have the freedom to provide abuse to officials or opponents, etc. The decorum must be achieved, right? This is something that would be the focus of game administration. We expect game administration to handle it. If the situation arises as officials, we go to game administration and we say, this needs to be addressed. Or we could say, this patron needs to be ejected from the game, right? I had a game where a parent comes out of the stands, goes around and starts abusing my table personnel about putting points up on the board or some such. They were directed to leave, right? Officials have influence. The idea here is that this is the purview of game administration. Officials get game administration on the case as necessary, and that's what we have here. Ay, ay, ay. So, unsporting behavior, unacceptable. Coaches don't get a safe haven in the huddle. Officials are not immune, and player profanity is not accepted. The exemption for, well, they wasn't directed at somebody else, they're just mad at themselves, is NFHS says no excuse. All right, let's move on now to screening, right? Every couple of years, illegal screening is a point of emphasis. Obviously, legal screening, of course, is a legal activity, right? Basketball says, hey, teammate of the player with the ball or teammate is allowed to position their body to slow or prevent the defense from staying with the player that they're guarding, right? This is legal activity. All of the restrictions are clearly outlined about what a screener must do and must not do. Remember, of course, that in the rules book, there's sometimes very specific language about what players cannot do. And there's also sometimes specific language about what players can do. And when it comes to screening, that is the case. So we have legal screening. Obviously, our screener must be stationary within the vertical plane, right? They can't lean outside the vertical plane. They can't lean forward. They can't extend their hips. They have both feet on the floor when the contact occurs. Time and distance are relevant. And the screener shall be stationary again, except in a unique situation where a screener and opponent are moving in the same path and the same direction. Not very common. Illegal screening is moving when the contact occurred, does not give sufficient time and distance. It does not give sufficient distance in setting a screen outside the field of vision of a stationary opponent, right? Think of we have a stationary opponent. The screener comes and stands immediately behind the player or some such. A player may not use their arms, hands, hips, shoulders to force movement through a screen or hold the screener and then push the screener aside, right? So there are specific requirements for defenders when dealing with a screen as well. And other restrictions outlined, right, as a review. We'll cover more of screening rules and restrictions in this week's episode of Basketball Rules Expert and 5 Play Friday. All right, moving on. Euro steps, spin moves, and jump stops, legal or illegal. So now traveling, which is always going to be a point of emphasis. You could probably they probably have it in the calendar for like the next 20 years. Okay, in 2021 we'll make traveling a point of emphasis, and then we'll do it again in 2024 and 2027 and 2030 and 2033 and 2036 because it is a fundamental element of the game, probably the most frequently called violation. Well, out of bounds, of course, the most frequently called. And officials have difficulty, have displayed having difficulty in adjudicating these plays properly, right? So from other levels come various moves that come into the high school game, right? Players see collegiate players see pro players. They have a move. Oh, I love that move. I'm going to work on that move. I can do that thing. I got that spin move down. I got the Euro step. I've been working on it. And I've got the step back, right? NFHS says, hey, just take a moment, right, and say we can't adjudicate these plays just based on the fact that, oh, that player Euro stepped, that must be a travel. Or that player did a spin move, that must be a travel. That player did a step back, that must be a travel, right? We can't put things in a box in that fashion. We have to evaluate traveling based on the rules, right? And the most important component of that is establishing the pivot foot and the official recognizing which is the pivot foot. That's the first step. If we adjudicate plays and they're not based on awareness of the pivot foot and the resulting actions, then we are essentially just, I wouldn't say guessing, but we are not operating within an understanding of the rules. We're operating more in the realm of the rhythm was off, it looked funny, that was funky, I don't think that was good, or whatever, right? If we understand the rules and restrictions and we identify the pivot foot, right? As you're a new official, right? We're out on the court, we're doing all these things. Maybe we don't know the traveling rules, we're not great at them, but the first step is identifying the pivot foot. We can do that, right? Every time a ball handler gets the ball, which is the pivot foot? Left foot, right foot. No pivot foot, right? They have caught the ball with both feet on the floor. They move one foot, establishes. Okay, right? The basics. If executed within the parameters, each of these plays is legal, of course, right? In and of themselves, doing a Euro step is not illegal. Lifting the pivot foot and putting it back on the floor is illegal, right? Spin moves are inherently not illegal, and jump stops, let's say it's the step back, not illegal. So NFHS says we have some inconsistency problem with traveling. We have plays that are being called a travel that are not a travel. We have plays that are not a travel and being called a travel. Did I get that right? We have plays that are not a travel being called a travel. And we have plays that are a travel and are not being ruled a travel. Nice little diagram here. Look at that. Spin move most often occurs when a player who dribbles toward the basket catches the ball while faking to one side of the basket, plants a foot, which becomes the pivot foot, while facing the basket, turns his or her back to the basket in an attempt to spin, and then steps with the other foot. This would be legal, of course, but if they return the pivot foot to the floor before releasing the ball it is illegal by rule. Spin moves are hard to execute legally. They are very difficult to execute legally, but they are, they happen really quickly with some players and are exciting plays in the game. The Euro step, right, is a move that player picks up the pivot foot, touches it to the floor again before release of the ball. Oh, wait. On the spin move, if a player picks up the pivot foot and touches the floor again, of course, that is a travel. NFHS refers to jump stops. We need to know legality of jump stops. Of course, we have a jump stop where a player catches the ball in the air and lands with both feet. We have jump stops where a player jumps off, catches the ball, jumps off 1 foot, and then lands on 2 feet, right? We have to be experts at adjudicating those plays. And in general, NFHS says all of these plays, officials need to reevaluate how they are adjudicating these plays and whether the adjudication is based on an accurate understanding of the rules and restrictions. Obviously, when a player begins a dribble, a player must release the ball before lifting his or her pivot foot. It is always legal for a player to lift the pivot foot, but the player must pass, shoot, or be granted a timeout before the pivot foot touches the floor again. And it's not possible for a player to travel while dribbling the ball, bouncing the ball while out of bounds, during a throw-in, or prior to attempting free throws. Officials need to do their job, identify the pivot foot, right? It's a basic habit that we have to incorporate into our understanding of what's going on the court. Right? So we get, traveling is a point of emphasis, right? Our job is not to say, okay, all right, we need to call more traveling. No. Point of emphasis say there is room for improvement in this area. Legal plays are being ruled illegal. Illegal plays are being ruled legal. We need better understanding of the rules and restrictions so that we can adjudicate plays more accurately. That is the point of emphasis. Accuracy in our rulings. Becoming aware of the pivot foot, the rules and restrictions, and so forth. And that's the way the points of emphasis work. If we look at the points of emphasis, the team control signal, obviously the elimination of the punch, timeout administration, being aware before we grant timeout requests, understanding that what the restrictions are, so that we can do the job better, not grant more timeouts, not grant fewer timeouts, just not grant timeouts when they are not legal by rule. Unsporting conduct, right? Focus on these areas, coaches in huddles, players, mad at themselves, etc. Fan behavior, how to use game administration, all of these things. Reviewing what's screening, what's legal activity by a screener, etc. Traveling and focusing on Euro steps, spin moves, and jump stops. And I would include the step back move as well, which if done in a certain fashion is legal. If not done, if done in a different fashion would be illegal. So today we've covered new rules, points of emphasis for 2021-2022 season. Mechanics changes, religious headgear, and the points of emphasis, right? We want to go through this. We want to review this as officials so that we can be better and proper use of the rules and restrictions when we administer our games. And I hope everybody has a fantastic season for the 2021-2022 season. Bring these points of emphasis into your game, especially early in the season, so we can get everybody on the same page. And I hope you have a fantastic season.